Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. Our CEO, Paul Otellini, has requested that we, the strategic management team, assist senior management in assessing Intel's position in the semiconductor industry, Intel's competitive advantage, and our response to the changing competitive landscape. I'd like to start off by introducing myself, Andre, and the members of the strategic management team, Alec, Matt, James, and Jonathan. Our team has examined Intel's position on a number of levels, and we're going to present to you our expert analysis. I'm going to start off by providing you the results of our industry analysis before handing it over to Matt. He's going to explain our advantage in the PC segment. James has assessed Intel's weaknesses in the smartphone segment. Alec will describe Intel's diversification into the software industry, and Jonathan's going to go over our final recommendations based on the data from our analysis. Okay, so we'll begin by assessing rivalry in the microprocessor industry. What we see is that there are only two relevant microprocessor companies, Intel and Advanced Micro Devices, AMD. Considering that there are only two companies dominating this industry, Intel and AMD are highly responsive to actions taken by each other, thus resulting in a low risk of a price war. Looking at the degree of product standardization in the industry, AMD is reverse engineering Intel's products, introducing their own version, and setting their price at roughly 75% of that of Intel's. There's a high degree of switching costs for microprocessor buyers in the industry due to primary source license agreements, research and development costs, and limited selection of microprocessor products. And the microprocessor industry has high growth rate. So overall, the intensity of rivalry is low. Now let's take a look at buyer power. The PC industry is the primary buyer of microprocessors. The top four buyers are responsible for less than 40% of the total PC industry volume, indicating that it is highly fragmented. There are high switching costs. The microprocessor represents a relatively large percentage of the total cost of a PC, therefore increasing price sensitivity of the buyer industry, because buyers tend to care more about getting a good price when the product that they are buying creates a large part of the cost of their own production. Most of the purchases are high volume purchases, and when buyers purchase in large volumes, they typically expect to get breaks in price. So essentially, the buyer is taking a risk by being willing to buy large amounts at once rather than smaller amounts over time. The microprocessor is one of the most essential components of the PC that determines quality. And lower cost of microprocessors generates a large competitive advantage. So overall, low bargaining power but high price sensitivity results in a neutral or low intensity of buyer power. When we look at supplier power, we consider the raw inputs in producing microprocessors, which is silicon and transistors, which is fairly commoditized. These raw materials have negligible importance to the end consumer and no threat of forward integration. Therefore, we would consider supplier power to be of low intensity in the microprocessor industry. Moving on to threat of new entrants. It's important to keep in mind that in general, microprocessor manufacturers incur huge fixed and sunk costs before they sell a single chip. But the input cost of each individual chip becomes negligible in a size of scale economy. This implies that in the microprocessor industry, it's a volume game, with the company selling the most chips in any generation makes the most money. It's also of equal importance to emphasize the size of investment in plant and machinery required to enter the microprocessor industry. The cost of building a fabrication facility or a fab is well above $2.5 billion. Marketing is a substantial component of entering the market, and as demonstrated by Intel's vigorously enforced patents and other intellectual property claims, cross-licensing, and partnership agreements are essential for a business plan in entering the microprocessor industry. Threat of new entry is extremely low, according to this analysis. And the threat of substitution is non-existent. So when we summarize the magnitude of the five forces, we find that the number and relative size of competitors is mildly competitive. The intensity of buyer power is neutral or low. The intensity of supplier power is low. The threat of new entrants is low, and there is no threat of substitutes. So as we see here, the magnitude of each of the five forces are very low. This would suggest that industry attractiveness and profitability are very high for firms that are already in the microprocessor industry. However, it's important to note that this analysis only considers external factors. In order to gain a more accurate estimation of profitability, I'm going to hand it over to Matt, who will provide us with insight into the industry's internal factors.
Thank you, Andre. My name is Matt Kubecki, and I will be conducting a VRIO analysis of Intel today. My goal is to analyze 3 resources or capabilities the Intel Corporation possesses, and then determine what kind of competitive advantage those resources or capabilities provide. The Intel brand being what it is today is a result of the Intel Inside campaign. It began in 1991 with a budget of nearly $150 million. $125 million of this was dedicated to supporting manufacturers who agreed to place the Intel Inside logo on their products and engage in joint advertising with Intel. This was one of Intel's most successful campaigns. It brought tremendous value to Intel, and by 1993, just 2 years later, Intel's brand preference reached 80%. Within 3 years since launching the program, over 1,200 PC manufacturers had signed up for the Intel Inside campaign. This type of marketing initiative had never been taken upon by a company in the microprocessor industry, and as such, it was a rare strategy. An unintended consequence of this massive marketing campaign was that Compaq, a computer manufacturer, went into negotiations with AMD, a competitor of Intel's, to produce compatible chips at a lower cost for their products. While this may have hurt Intel's sales down the line, AMD and Compaq did not develop a similar marketing strategy. Intel's organization devoted an enormous amount of money to their Intel Inside program and organized their whole organization around it. In fact, even today, Intel produces products with the Intel Inside logo on the exterior. Continued use and focus around this marketing strategy has allowed Intel to achieve a sustained, for nearly 30 years, competitive advantage. The second resource or capability I will cover is the copy exactly capability. This process started with Intel perfecting the processes that could minimize defects and maximize yield. Once Intel had done this, it then cloned the process, or one could say copied exactly, in different manufacturing plants throughout the world. This capability originally started as an operational capability. It has progressed to be a dynamic capability. Intel now uses identical production lines to determine the root causes of lower yields. One recent case demonstrating this dynamic capability was when identical tools in different factories were producing different defect rates. Intel swapped the workers who cleaned the tools and discovered that they used different techniques when cleaning. One which was less efficient at cleaning. Does this capability bring in value to Intel? Yes, it increases yields and lowers the cost of each chip. Is this capability rare? Yes, Intel was able to produce 6 to 8 times the volume of chips as their most consistent competitor, AMD, which gave Intel a major cost advantage and profit advantage. No one else was utilizing this capability. Speaking of competitors, AMD was Intel's most consistent competitor, and they were not able to implement the same attention to detail in manufacturing that Intel had developed. Intel's two-in-a-box management style allowed for their copy exactly manufacturing method to be supported. With an engineer focused solely on implementation, they were destined to succeed. Altogether, this represents a long-term competitive advantage for Intel according to the VRIO analysis. The Atom chips were a resource produced by Intel for the first time in 2008. These chips were a low-power chip designed to compete for placement in mobile devices. They required a similar amount of power management as their closest competitor. Intel was late to introduce a low-power chip for mobile devices. The Atom chip allowed Intel to tap into that sector and create value for the company. In Q4 2009, Intel was able to generate $438 million in Atom chip sales. Their Atom chips were in heavy demand as consumers wanted a mobile device that would not require charging and it would last all day. This chip was designed to meet that demand. In 2007, a year before Intel launched their Atom chip, their competitor ARM commanded a 98% market share of the smartphone market. There were not many companies who were able to produce a lower chip like Intel and ARM. Intel's Atom microchip was able to be imitated because it was the imitator. Intel looked to ARM to determine how to develop their new chip, and how to decide how much power management the chip would require. Intel still centered their strategy on making newer and more powerful chips, but their time and resources spent to develop the Atom chip allowed for a temporary competitive advantage when entering the smartphone market with microchips. Thank you. Up next, James will delve into Intel's weaknesses.
Hi everyone, my name is Alec Blair, and I'm going to be walking through Intel's diversification strategy and how they plan to create value from that strategy, as well as how the acquisition of McAfee Security Systems fell into that process. So for starters, Intel's diversification strategy, it stems from the theory mentioned in the textbook that a company competing in a few related markets will typically outperform those who compete in a single or many markets. And at the start of 2005, Intel was actually only competing in one market, which was the market for PCs. And they had grown respectably in that market. However, between 2012 and 2017, projected growth in technology showed an annual growth of -4% in the PCs, while segments of the market, including Chromebooks and tablets, showed 46% and 26% growth respectively annually. And I think this is where Intel decided to push into these growing markets and try their hand at successfully merging and competing in new technologies. Their diversification strategy utilized both exploitation and exploration. Exploitation meaning the use of current resources to increase customer base, adopt new technologies, or broaden existing production capacity. And exploration meaning the acquisition of already existing companies who are well established in a given section of the market. So to kind of give a further background, Intel had been a leading competitor for many years in the invention and production of state-of-the-art microchip processors and PCs. And when planning to merge into these new markets, Intel devoted time and energy away from that production for specifically PCs and shifted gears towards developing chips that would be compatible with smartphone and tablet technologies. And this is an example of Intel's exploitation of current resources. So in their new products development that they planned to create value through setting goals of what their products would include and be capable of. These goals included low heat and power requirements, as well as lower production costs and backwards compatibility with other Intel products. And this is when they released their first product in the new market, which was the Atom product line, which was just a chip that was compatible with smartphone and tablet technologies. And this product line was meant to be a competitor to the already dominant ARM product line with the same capabilities and price points. However, Atom did not really show much success given that ARM was already so dominant in that segment of the market. So moving forward to exploration. So between the years of 2004 and 2012, Intel purchased 12 different companies, all with specific goals in mind. So the textbook kind of cited the fact that Intel found it quicker to purchase these new dynamic software capabilities rather than to develop them in-house. And in doing so, Intel actually began to branch out pretty successfully into these new growing markets. So now looking at how these diversification strategies had built value for Intel. So for starters, looking at diversification through expansion. So as I stated, Intel had actually gone on a buying spree between 2004 and 2012 that significantly increased its knowledge and presence in this market. And during its acquisition of one company in particular, which was Wind River, which was a software writing company for embedded devices, the end goal for Intel was to expedite its production processes through acquisition of an already existing company that specialized in software technologies. And this, coupled with acquisition of existing companies like Nordic Edge and McAfee Securities, kind of led Intel to not only look to improve upon existing products, but to also introduce new products that had not been put on the market before. So for diversification through exploitation, this did not prove to be largely beneficial to Intel until after they had actually acquired these other companies and that were already established in the market. They then had plans to utilize those resources to introduce new products such as hardware-driven security systems to their customers. So this hardware-driven security system would ultimately create value through introducing a new product to the customer base that covered one of the three pillars of customer demand that we typically look at, which was personal privacy. So now I'm going to kind of look at the acquisition specifically of McAfee and how that deal could have benefited or could provide benefit to Intel. So the stepping stone process is one of the 8S mechanisms, and it kind of entails acquisition of another company that will allow a firm to successfully shift its position through diversification and migration. So according to chapter 6 of the textbook, adjacent markets have two characteristics. So they'll allow the firm to exploit some of the resources and capabilities that they have to create value. And they'll also allow the firm to acquire related resources and capabilities to prepare for the next step. And I think that this acquisition served as kind of a stepping stone for Intel. So as they would acquire a company in McAfee that had high brand recognition, that had also secured a large share of the company or the computer security market. This acquisition ultimately served as a stepping stone for Intel to enter the world of cybersecurity, specifically with regard to smartphone technologies. So through this investment, Intel was actually able to stay ahead of technology. So it's pretty obvious by now that Intel was not actually, they were actually looking to dive into a largely evolving technological market. And in addition to this, it seemed that like Intel was pretty late to the party, as other known firms had already established themselves as large competitors and established a good chunk of the market share. And it's kind of discussed through the Intel case that they opted to buy existing firms in these sectors in order to expedite the process of entry. So this provided Intel a head start, basically, or not necessarily a head start, but a catching up point. And in the case of McAfee, it provided the ability to expedite production of security features for the new software devices. So this created value for Intel in considering the time that would have been lost in research and development had they still wanted to go this route of security systems for these smartphone technologies. So with this deal, Intel and McAfee benefited if their singular goal, they reached a level of synergy as they would have benefited if their singular goals were to be reached. So lastly, when looking at the acquisition deal, Intel and McAfee agreed to allow the security giant, being McAfee, to kind of continue operations as an independent subsidiary. So this did a couple things. Not only did it allow Intel access to McAfee's revenue and intellectual properties, but it also provided Intel a new entry point to the market for smartphones through security systems. So in addition to this, McAfee's remaining as an independent subsidiary allowed for the company to continue to utilize its high brand recognition as a leader in cybersecurity software with an end goal of achieving a hardware-based security system. So their synergistic goal between the two companies was to ultimately achieve this hardware-driven security system that would make for much higher levels of protection from hacking and viruses. And this was something of the likes that no other company had yet produced, and therefore, given its ability to market itself as a security giant, it was suitable for McAfee to actually remain as an individual unit in order to kind of capitalize on the value creation potential of that acquisition, being that it had already established itself as a reliable source of security systems. And that's really all that I've got in terms of acquisition of McAfee and diversification strategies for Intel. So now I'm just kind of handing it off to Jonathan to finish off the presentation.
Hi, my name is James Matheson. I'll be covering resources, capabilities of Intel and ARM, and how those provided strengths and weaknesses to their overall strategies. So first, we'll cover some activities. ARM's activities that created value. Basically, the way it was established, ARM was a second source provider. So they were that cost advantage strategy that our textbook refers to. And what they did is they provided price protection to consumers of chips. They also took already established chips that were maybe designed, invented by other companies such as Intel, and they reverse engineered these and produced them at a very low cost, which allowed them to sell their chip for a low cost. So them merely existing allowed consumers another option. They later used this licensing business model to sell their design wins in the cell phone segment, and we'll cover that a little bit later. Low cost and low power design afforded them the ability to circumvent about $5 million of upfront costs in building and staffing. Intel, activities that failed to create value. So Intel was the opposite strategy. They were a differentiator in the segment. So what they did to produce product profits was they created an economy of scale. They invested $1 billion to secure thin margins in the segment, and they had to really do this to offset their research and development costs. They also had a failed venture in branding. They had a joint PC advertisement venture in order to increase their brand name among the chip industry with PCs, and this actually backfired a bit because PC suppliers felt that Intel's chip branding was taken away from their own brand. Intel, after about 1990, increased their acquisitions, and they were highly criticized for this by its shareholders because they felt it failed to produce value. Also, Intel had a couple failed ventures in backward integration. So later on, Intel, when it entered the cell phone segment, basically low power was a good thing for chips. So Intel had very high power chips, and what they tried to do is they tried to backwards integrate what ARM's low cost, low power chips were doing in the segment, and they retailed their chip called the Atom, which consumed about 2 watts of power for about $44. It was able to be purchased by customers. And then what ARM's chip in the segment already did was consumed about 1.9 watts. So didn't win on the power consumption front, and then also consumers also had the option to purchase a 4-watt power consumption chip for about $29. So they weren't winning in price, and they weren't winning in the low power consumption. ARM's resource and capability strengths. So first we'll cover resources. What ARM had was human resources. Its co-founders, Ferber and Wilson, basically their leadership. There's a story in the text of when they went out to check out a research area, and they were expecting to see this large production, but what they found were just a couple people working on that project. And this led them to their leadership philosophy. To be profitable, they had to keep expenses low. So ARM had human resources in the sense of its leadership, not necessarily a gigantic staff. Also, it utilizes philosophy to leverage licensing to collect royalties as its primary form of profit. Moving on to capabilities. What ARM had was dynamic capability, and this assisted them in the cell phone segment because what their low power consumption chip provided was it provided smartphone users long untethered online experiences. So basically, a smartphone user didn't have to go back to a power source such as plugging in or charging their phone. They could just unplug it and have it all day, and they could download basic forms of software which basically provided what they needed for a program. So they didn't need very advanced programs which would drain the battery, but this low power was allowing them to be untethered, which is what cell phone users valued. Intel's resource and capabilities, which built to its weakness. So resources. Intel had a lot of physical resources. They focused on an economy of scale inside the PC chip market, and this didn't carry over well to the cell phone segment because basically they were unable to match ARM's strategy. They also had intangible resources that failed to create value because their skill set, the skill sets that they did not have, they tried to acquire or just basically purchase. And they, as we know, you can't just drag and drop companies into another parent company. So what they ended up doing is overpaying for a lot of acquisitions, and many of their acquisitions failed. Moving on to capabilities, Intel's operation capabilities were focused on performance over efficiency and cost. Because the segment of PCs basically they were set up at desks and they had a power source at all times, it led them to not valuing that low power consumption, which led into their failure to maintain value and rarity in the chip segment. So their high power consumption led to less untethered experiences for cell phone users, and their high performance programs and software such as Microsoft Office didn't provide a whole lot of value to cell phone users because they were able to download very basic software that accomplished the same function. Finally, I'll cover ARM's imitation barriers that established against Intel. First, path dependence. What ARM did is establish vertical integration by controlling the design process and then sold the right to produce their chips. So essentially, it pioneered the way that profits were going to be made in the cell phone segment. Moving on, tacit knowledge. Intel was unable to match the low power and performance of ARM's chips. One of its attempts, the Silverthorne, was just low power, low performance, because what they did is Intel reverted back to one of its very old model chips in order to save costs, and it just didn't bode well for the company. Moving on, time compressing diseconomies. In 2007, ARM owned about 98% of the smartphone industry. Intel, conversely, owned about 1% in 2012. And ARM established a very early reputation, which allowed it to build into its partnerships, and basically made it very difficult for Intel to enter the segment because they had already established a presence. And they had played catch up over the years. Moving on, network effect and first mover advantages. Again, that ties closely with the time compression diseconomies, but it was the chip of choice in the segment because it moved early. It established itself with the Nokia 6110, the first phone to have analog and digital networks, and then visual icons and games on its phone. So it was becoming the natural choice, which also led it to being selected for the original Apple iPhone. Finally, we'll pass off to Alec, which will cover Intel's overall strategy.
Thank you, Alec. I'm Jonathan Yard. I'm going to talk about some specific actionable recommendations that will allow Intel to sustain and improve its performance. In 2007, Intel found itself locked out of the smartphone market. Intel did not sit idly by. They responded by developing their internal products and acquiring other companies. They need to continue with that product development and work on developing a chip that will work in the smartphone market. This chip needs to be low cost, needs to be low heat, needs to be low power, and since they've acquired some companies now that work in different areas with hardware and software, they need to try to make a chip that will have that hardware and software loaded already on that chip, specifically Wind River and McAfee. The value created from this chip would be the first product in a new market. This would be a new market with these smartphone chips that would already have their hardware, the software loaded that consumers would want on there. And this would help them grow a share of the smartphone market. Right now, they're kind of a non-player in the smartphone market. And if they were the first to create a product, this would help get smartphone manufacturers to use their chips. The resources, capabilities needed. They'll need human resources, financial resources, physical resources, and tangible resources. All these things they have. And Andy Grove, the CEO, became the CEO in 1987. He worked tirelessly to make Intel a world-class manufacturing organization. He often combined new product generation with a new fabrication process. They need to get back to their roots, to that culture. Their technology strategy used to revolve around just hiring the brightest engineers they could find. They need to continue to do that, but they've bought other companies, so now they really don't have to hire people, the smartest minds, dealing with security software, since they purchased McAfee, and dealing with software for smartphones, since they bought other companies. Now they have those human resources. They have those very smart workers, the brightest workers that they always used to have. Now they need to use them, and they all need to work together. Financially, we have that money, obviously, to buy the companies and to work on building this new chip. The physical resources, they've got the space, they've got the warehouses, the fabs to mass produce these chips. If they're able to come up with on the tangible resources, they got the brand. Intel is very well known. Um, Something to think about the good product. They're already brand aware. People are aware of their brand. That'll help them out. Operating